Thank you, Roxanne.
Do you want me to hold that while you organize yourself?
I can't function without my notes in the middle, but okay. Roxanne, first of all, congratulations, 34 years. The greatest bookstore in our region.
Sure.
I've done events with Roxanne in New Haven, but it's the first time I've done an event here, which is thrilled. This book on Yale has a long origin story. It started a lot of different places. It began for me in September 2020, depth of the COVID pandemic. Peter Salovey, the president of Yale, called me and asked me if I would manage research and write up a report on Yale's, he used the word then, entanglements with slavery over the years. And I've said this many times, I've said this to Peter. I had about 30 seconds on the phone. I was sort of praying that that phone call wasn't happening. I didn't. It's a monster. You know, it's a huge project. I didn't know how to start it first, except that I asked one and then two of my colleagues in the libraries, Mike Moran in the Beinecke Library, if you know Michael. And eventually, within the first year of the project, from the president's office, I was assigned a young woman named Hope McGrath. And Hope, at that point, was working in the president's office as a speechwriter and researcher and this and that. But she had a PhD in American history. And she's a really good historian. At one point, Peter knew I needed her. He said, why don't we just give you Hope for the duration of the project? And I said, yes. And we were off to the search. We had a whole string of student research assistants. Students do what students do. They graduate, they leave, they vanish. But eventually we had a team of about 4 key researchers, real professional researchers, although 2 of them are still graduate students, they're pros. And without them, of course, this couldn't have happened. They amassed enormous material, evidence, sources of all kinds, almost entirely from the Yale libraries, although not quite entirely. We drew on other places and sources, but this was a story hiding in plain sight in the Yale libraries for centuries. And they would amass all this material, and I've never written a book like this, with other people doing the archival digging and then amassing it all in electronic documents, which is still an adjustment for me, and then sending it all to me. Dossiers, huge dossiers for this chapter, and then that chapter, and this topic, and that topic. And I was essentially the writer. I mean, I did some of the research myself, but without this team, this thing wouldn't exist. It was the most collaborative thing we've ever did. And I have to say quickly too, Peter Salovey sponsored this. He asked for it, and he owns it, and it's to his credit. Now, his own evolution to getting to this point has a story, of course. I don't want to read all of that, but you know, he didn't just wake up one day and decide to do this. And I learned through the process that he had his board of trustees on board from day one. I've been told that. After 3 presentations to the board about this project, which got easier and easier because I sensed they really were into it. Now, 10 or 12 or so years ago, they may not have been. This is a product of time and place. And one of the evolutions of this is a process now of actually more than 20 years that universities have been studying slavery in their past and other issues in the past. But it began really with Brown University, University of Virginia, and a couple others. And over time, there are now more than 80 universities belong to an organization called University Studying Slavery. It may have plateaued now. I mean, small colleges done it too, especially in the South. And there's still some to get to it. But I want to say too, and Roxanne sort of more than hinted at this. I had a certain principle at work in this. Not everybody completely agreed with me all the time on this. How could they? It's a collaborative project. There were people along the way throughout the vast Yale University network, and we did all kinds of webinars and trying to present our findings. And as others have told me, manage expectations. There were people along the way who wanted to stick the knife in and turn it harder on Yale, on this whole story. That wasn't my job. My job was to be a historian and find the truth, as old-fashioned as that may sound. Well, it's not old-fashioned anymore. You may have noticed the word truth around here and there the last 8 or 10 years, more than I ever remember. Weird words like evidence, facts, and their alternatives. But my purpose here was not to write a history with one eye on what Yale would do about it. That was frankly the president and the board's responsibility, and they are doing a lot about it. And after midnight, we could talk about it. Some of them very public, some of them not quite yet. But my job was to find what we could find and tell it, organize it in a way that could be readable. In fact, when Peter asked me to write a report, like virtually all other universities have done, I said, no, I don't want to write a report. Report with bullet points and a few graphs and a little narrative that's thrown on the shelf. I don't want to do that. I said, let's write a narrative history, a real history about people. And he said, great idea. And of course, you're going to write it. Yes, sir. So that's what we wrote. And it's not written for my colleagues. It's written for you. It's written for the public. It's written for the intelligent readers in this country, which there are millions who want to read history. I discovered that with my Frederick Douglass book. There are a lot of people who want to read some history. And the principle gets boiled down to this. I had a mentor in my career, and I was very lucky to have a few. But one of them was Nathan Huggins, great African-American historian who had the courage to hire me at Harvard for a couple of years. And then he died quickly of cancer. But I wrote an essay about Nathan as a tribute after he died. And I looked him up, and nobody uses it anymore, but the who's who. Still publish that? I don't think they do.
It's probably digital.
It's digital if it exists. But Nathan had written, or some, yeah, he had written a who's who entry. Lo and behold, I found this, and I've used this as an epigraph. I've put it on the door of my office. I've put it all kinds of places. Nathan said, I find in the study of history, I find in the study of history a special discipline which forces me to consider peoples and ages not my own. It is the most humane of disciplines, and in ways the most humbling, for we cannot ignore those historians of the future who will look back upon us in the same way. And especially when you're writing a story about an institution's history, about a very difficult subject, you're making constant judgments. How to couch this, how to couch that, how to explain Samuel Morse, how to explain as your styles, how to explain this, explain that. You're making judgments all the time. But judgments by historians need to come from a deep kind of Augustinian humility. They don't always, as you know. In case you haven't noticed, humility hasn't been exactly in vogue the last. But it was Augustine who said, if you plan to build a tower that pierces the clouds, lay its foundations in humility. He described how you're supposed to do that. So, now this book. We stopped in 1915, which I will explain in a few minutes by talking about the Yale War Memorial, which all of you have seen if you've ever walked through Woolsey Hall. But I want to explain how we shaped this book. First of all, its purpose is, as I've just said, is to write a history. To do what good history does. It explains, it informs us in our present. It may or may not help us know what to do about it, although it makes us informed when we do whatever we do about it. To do good history in a world that often does not trust universities. It's no news either, is it? Universities. President of Columbia there was grilled by a congressional committee, and I haven't seen any news yet. I hope she still has her job as of this evening.
So far.
The idea of the American university and colleges is very much contested these days in our politics and in our economy, at least. We have three big subjects here, and this was a kind of collective decision. And by the way, President Salovey's board, administration, no one ever tried to control one word that we wrote. The general counsel's office wanted to see chapters. And then we were very careful how we showed anything until we were ready. And when I'd present to the board, the general counsel, this nice guy, but that was his job. He would come up to us and he'd say, "What are you finding?" What do we have to know? What's coming? We'd say, "It's all right. It'll be all right. Maybe." But eventually, we told them everything. Anyway, we have three major subjects in this book. One is the university, its people, its growth through time, its purposes, its mores, its place in the world of knowledge. This little collegiate school, formed first out here in Saybrook, fledgling, nearly dying, moves over to New Haven, 1716, and then calls itself Yale College because it gets this big gift from this guy, this dandy, this landed gentry, super wealthy dude in London named Yale. But it's the story of a university and its growth through time into the largest college in America by the early 19th century, and certainly in the 19th century becomes the most influential, if not one of the two or three most influential. Our second subject was Connecticut and New England and the nation. What is Yale's place in all those environments, in those contexts? Through the lens of slavery and race and racism, or through any lens. But that's where we had to deal with such things, and many things, but as learning a lot about the Connecticut economy of the 18th century. It turns out about 50% of all commerce moving out of Connecticut, out of New Haven Harbor or London Harbor or any other harbor, or even Middletown, which was, of course, an ocean port. About 50% of all commerce out of Connecticut went to the West Indies, went to the sugar nexus, went to the slave economy of mostly the British West Indies. Huge dependence. Cattle, horses, onions, all kinds of foodstuffs were on every ship nearly that went out of Connecticut, most of them. in the West Indies. So there's this connection to the world of slave trading, and it will have a direct impact on who Yale's donors become and their leadership. And then our third subject was New Haven itself, and particularly its Black community, which was there from the beginning, small, but growing with time. Enslaved in many cases in the 18th century, enslaved by Yale people in the 18th century. And we have in the book a little interlude, and you'll see this, where we simply listed the names with just a little headnote of the 240 odd names of slaves that we actually found who were owned at one point or another by Yale people. We never found any evidence that the college itself owned slaves, like the University of Virginia did, or Georgetown University, or Southern University, which literally owned people, sold them, traded them. As far as we know, Yale didn't do that. But the Black community of New Haven is a fascinating history. It's an incredible story of growth through time into a community built around its churches, and with a eventually mostly working class population that mostly worked at Yale. And gee whiz, they still do. Eventually, and we do this in the later chapters in the book, the 10th and 11th chapters in the later 19th century, we continue that story of the Yale, of the New Haven community. But also, it turns out a lot of people, Black people, who worked at, some of them former fugitive slaves, some of them not, who worked at Yale, eventually had sons who went to Yale. And there's a remarkable series. You know about the Manning. I know. God bless you. Well, we have a whole interlude on the Manning family because they made a great prototype of this story, an intergenerational story. It was very much part of Yale's history. So, those are the three big subjects. And the goal is to keep all three of those subjects alive in every chapter. Somehow, every chapter. You know, some more than others, of course. Now, again, the idea here was to keep our eyes on the subject and not on the world outside that would be crying for reparation and repair. We did a lot of webinars, we did events, we did all this research in the COVID crisis. In fact, when we first started the research, the libraries weren't open. What in the hell am I doing here? Literally couldn't walk in. Of course, there's a lot of digital stuff out there, but once they opened again in January of 21, I was the first researcher. By the end of that week, there were 3 of us. In fact, university, one of the university photographers came and took my picture in the reading room. Yes, there are people in the library. A lot of what we end up having to do here is look at Yale's leadership. And, you know, I never wanted to write about these people. They're not my subject. But now I do know a lot about Thomas Clapp, and Ezra Stiles, Benjamin Silliman, and Theodore Dwight. Difficult subject, Theodore Dwight. Theodore Dwight Woolsey, naming themselves after each other. And I didn't go to Yale. I don't carry I don't have a necktie from Silliman College. It's not my pen. I went to public universities in the Midwest. I'm just one of those, you know, they hire anybody to lucky people who gets to work there and use those incredible sources. Now, let me say a couple other things about how we organized and wrote, and then if I could focus just a bit on that war memorial at the end. Findings, surprises. I've been asked all the time, what are surprises? Well, there are a lot of them. One is just how ubiquitous slaveholding was among 18th century ministers. It simply was normative. Doesn't mean they all did. but it was quite normative for an 18th century clergy, Puritan, Calvinist, congregational minister in Connecticut or around New England. And by the mid 18th century, approximately 50% of all ministers in New England were trained at the Yale Theology School. Including Jonathan Edwards, the great Jonathan Edwards, who is, to my view, still Jonathan Edwards. But he owned essentially 2 slaves most of his life, 1 male, 1 female. Then you go over to Newport, Rhode Island to buy them. Learned a lot here about the 17th century. In fact, I decided early on this can't begin just with the founding of Yale and the 10 ministers who meet out in Saybrook and so on and so forth. No, we had to explain Connecticut in the 17th century, and especially the 2 big Indian wars, the Pequot War and King Philip's War. Whereupon most of the native peoples of Connecticut and southern lower New England were moved out or wiped out. Not completely destroyed, although there are no Quinnipiac left. So I went back and told some of that history, because without that, I don't think there's a college by New Haven Harbor by 1701 if that history hadn't happened. Then there's how common slavery was, even at the time of the American Revolution and its wake. You probably know this because you're from Connecticut. Connecticut had the longest gradual emancipation plan, put in place in 1884. The last vestige of enslaved people weren't free until the 1840s. It was one method that slavery ended in New England, but only one. And it was the slowest. And as many Connecticut folks at the time were quite proud, the most moderate. In fact, the word moderate became a keyword for us. And at one point, I started using the term aggressive moderation. It sounds a bit odd. Remember Molly Ivins' old line? Molly Ivins?
Yes.
Ain't nothing in the middle of the road but a yellow line and a dead armadillo. I heard her give a commencement speech at Amherst College and was, oh my God, she was unbelievable. But anyway, we had to dig into who led this place, created it, founded it, built it. In fact, that was actually one of the things Peter talked to me about. The first time we talked about this is see if we can figure out who built this place. How many buildings constructed? Of course, we found this had been slightly known, but not much. There are very serious records about the building of buildings, and especially of Connecticut Hall. Next time you're on the campus, and by the way, there's a lot of new signage that's going to be appearing. It isn't all up yet. It takes time to commemorate this story. A lot of things are happening about that. But anyway, Connecticut Hall, the oldest brick structure in Connecticut, national landmark building, built in 1748 to 1750. Commissioned by then President Thomas Clapp, and Thomas Clapp himself kept very careful records of the workers. And we have all these images are in the book. We have an image of that document where he lists the workers, including Reverend Noyes Negro, Reverend Clapp's Negro, etc. 5 of the 22 laborers that built Connecticut Hall over a 2-year period were slaves. 2 of them, in addition, were free black men, a man named Jethro Luke and his son named Gad. And Jethro Luke is an amazing story. He was born a slave. Exactly how he got his freedom in New Haven, we're not clear on. But what we do know is he owned a little farm. And you'll see this in the book as we show the map. He owned a little farm, piece of land, at the corner of Grove and York Street. It's almost exactly where the Yale Law School is today. On the earliest map of New Haven, it's called Jethro's Corner. Jethro and Gad, between 1748 and 1750, their job, other than running their own little farm, and by the way, the folks at the law school, when they found this out, thought, oh, man, we're going to put Jethro Luke up here. Do you have any pictures of him? 1840. But seriously, Jethro and Gad walked what is now like diagonally across the Yale campus, 10-minute walk, over to where they were building Connecticut Hall, most days for 2 years. And President Clapp has them down for the hundreds of days they worked. And he recorded the days of labor of these workers down to the half day. 179 and a half days. 184 and a half days. So we dedicated the book to Jethro and Gad and his wife, whose name was Mindwell, and he actually had a daughter and actually a second wife. They got there too. It just seemed right. So, you know, there's that story. There's a labor story. And then you go into the stop quickly on the American Revolution. You may know this or may not. Yale almost was burned down in the American Revolution. The British landed right on New Haven Harbor, a huge contingent of forces, and invaded the town and all up and down the coast around New Haven Harbor, and several pitched battles were fought. You know, there are a few legends about it. Yale students picked up muskets and went to war. Some of them did. And so did Ezra Stiles, who had just a little while earlier become president himself, early in his life, was slaveholding. Although I came to really like Ezra Stiles. He's a fascinating man. And little did I know that the great Edmund Morgan, historian at Yale for half a century, and one of my favorite historians ever, he wrote a biography of Ezra Stiles. And I had never read it for this project. It's a brilliant biography. Anyway, but the British just suddenly got less interested and went back to out into Long Island Sound, because they could have what Yale was at that time, 75 years into its history, a series of brick buildings they could have destroyed it all, but they didn't. Then we move into the early 19th century, the antebellum era, and that for me, I mean, the 19th century is my research century. I belong mostly in the 19th century, or 12th century, or wherever I belong. And here it really got interesting for me, because Yale luminaries, whether they were faculty, famous scientists like Benjamin Silliman, theologians, writers, the early founders of the first law school, the early founders of the first medical school, on and on and on. Anti-slavery begins to appear. Some, not that many, but some. And we get complicated people like Leonard Bacon, who 42 years was the minister of Center Church in the middle of the Green. Famous Yale, but he became the consummate Yale moderate and leader of the New England Colonization Society, group that tried for decades to organize the removal of Black Americans from the United States to Africa, to Liberia, or to other places. And so there, I was, I know there are a dozen or more people from the 1810 to the 1850s, more than a dozen, that I tell the story through. And they're a differing lives, even though they all are connected to Yale, teach at Yale, went to Yale, graduated from Yale. They include people like James Hillhouse. They have all kinds of things in New Haven named after him. Complicated man. Became a U.S. Senator, was the treasurer of Yale for 35 years or something. The most famous street is named after him. High schools are named after him. Fellowships are named after him. He was a very big-time slaveholder. And yet also makes speeches against slavery. You You think Thomas Jefferson was complicated? So were a lot of these people. It's going to include Samuel Morse, possibly the most famous Yale in the world by the 1850s because of the telegraph, especially when they put the cable across the Atlantic. It was like landing on the moon. It was a moon landing. And this guy invented it. He never owned any slaves, but in some ways he's the most repulsive character in the book. He was so racist. He was pro-slavery. He was pro-Confederate. He was anti-Semitic. He was anti-everything. But he was a genius with some tough views. Now, along the way, I did a couple other things. Along the way, I would venture out into the community story, into the Connecticut story, into the bigger, larger story. For example, when I began the post-revolution chapter on the early 19th century, I decided to use quotes, several actually, from petitions by Black soldiers who were all from Connecticut, some of them right from New Haven. These are men who enlisted in the Continental Army in the American Revolution. One of them served a full 8 years and survived. Some served 3, some 4, some this, some that. Lots of them wrote personal petitions to the state of Connecticut, to the United States, demanding their full rights. And they did it in the language of the natural rights tradition. They did it in Jefferson's language. They did it in the language of the Declaration of Independence. It was amazing. And I thought, all right, I'll begin with them. But I end that chapter, which takes us to the 1820s, 30s, with the first ever slave narrative written by an American-born slave whose name was William Grimes. He was born in Virginia, sold 5 times while a slave, eventually sold to Savannah, Georgia, where he escaped in about 1820. He escaped by ship in the hold up to New York City and walked up to New Haven. He almost never was able to make a good living, although he had tussles with the law and on and on. But the first time he wrote his narrative was 1822, and it is a stunning narrative. It's now published, it'll be published. Grimes will live out his life all the way to the Civil War in New Haven on Chapel Street. He worked for the boys at Yale. He cleaned their rooms, he brought them food, he did this, whatever they wanted, he did. And that narrative he will republish again in 1855. And it's a unique text because there was no genre yet. He didn't know he was supposed to be using certain conventions of slave narratives because he hadn't been told. I mean, this is 20 years before Frederick Douglass's narrative, and there were some before Douglass. But it's a raw, bitter, angry story of what slavery was really like. Grimes is buried right at the Grove Street Cemetery, right inside the main gate. His grave is not marked very well, but that's where it is. Right in it's right, it abuts right up against that brick house that's the office of the Grove Street Cemetery. So we made a big deal out of old Grimes, as he called himself. Let me take us through to the end of where we chose to end the book. There's a lot I'm leaving out, like what the Civil War did. Like what the Civil War did to Yale. Well, I'll say one thing about that. Yale starts recruiting Southerners in, well, beginning of the 19th century, especially. I mean, Calhoun graduates in 04. He just happens to be the most famous. There weren't a huge amount of them. But by the teens and into the 1820s, and right through the 1840s, about 15% of the Yale student body, and eventually it's about 550 students, are the sons of planters. They're slaveholding boys in their late teens and early 20s. And by the way, New Haven, you may know, became a kind of, you may not see it that way today, but It became a kind of summer resort for Southern planters. There were a couple of hotels, one in particular right on Worcester Square, that catered to these Southerners. They also came here to buy their carriages. They had a big carriage industry, prominent industry. They bought their carriages here and they started sending them sons here. And that had an effect on the student body, student life. There was a Southern student organization called the Calliopean Society, et cetera, until the 1850s. And the more and more the slavery issue began to tear apart the American political system and the American nation, with all sorts of events you'd be familiar with about the 1850s, Southerners were more than welcome at Yale. And I could tell you various ways that happened. But by the late 1850s, and certainly by the secession winter of 1860-61, they're almost all gone back home. And the war tore Yale apart for a while, though it never closed. And in that Civil War chapter is also the story, if you don't know it, of the great Black Regiment that was commissioned in the state of Connecticut, two of them actually, the 29th and 30th Connecticut Colored Volunteers, Connecticut Regiment, that were formed and mustered right in New Haven. And all of those soldiers were from Connecticut towns. It's an amazing story. And they trained in that little, what is now a park at the end of Chapel Street. And no less than Frederick Douglass came there to address them in February of 1864, just before they were about to embark for the South. And he gave a stunning speech. I have a text of it. And it's not what people expect from Douglass. You may know Douglass had two sons in the Army already. He gave them a "you're in the Army now" speech. Obey your orders. Watch your morals. Don't drink. Shoot straight. Yeah, I know you got all white officers, but suck it up. Deal with it. Yes, sir, Colonel Douglas. All right, last point. Yale didn't have a Civil War moment in the wake of the war. It began to think about it right at the end of the war, like so many other institutions. You may know that Harvard built what is still, I think, the largest single building at Harvard is Harvard Memorial Hall as a memorial to its Harvard dead in the Civil War. And they unveiled that huge place at Harvard in 1875 or 6. Yale initially thought about building a special chapel and making it its Civil War memorial. And they began to raise money for it. And that became Patel Chapel. If you're familiar with the campus. But it was not made into a Civil War memorial. It just wasn't, for reasons that are in the book, but not always discernible. Official Yale just wasn't that keen to do it. Partly because they had to figure out what to do with all the Confederates. So they just put it off. They put it off for 2 decades. They opened Patel Chapel in 1876, but it's not a Civil War memorial. It's a magnificent structure. Mid-90s, the student newspaper starts appealing to the university. Why don't we have a Civil War memorial? And so a committee was formed. The committee meets on and off, but not much, for 5 years. And then Yale had its 200th anniversary in 1901. Bicentennial. Now, if you're familiar with the Yale campus, all the buildings around the binding, Woolsey Hall with its columns and all the names of the battles in the First World War, the Commons, and so on and so forth, and then Woodbridge Hall, which used to be the president's office. That whole set of buildings were known for quite some time as the Bicentennial Building, and they were designed by the same brilliant designer who created the New York Public Library, which is still my favorite building in New York City, especially the inside. But Okay, Blanky was, built to the 1960. Now, all right, you got these bicentennial buildings built, but in the corridor, like the vestibule between the Great Wolsey Hall Performance Hall, which had a great organ from the beginning, but there were concerts there. That was part of the building. And then the Commons. The whole thing is now called the Schwarzman Center because Steve Schwarzman gave them 200 million or whatever.
A lot of zeros.
A lot of zeros and a lot of restoration. But the vestibule, you all walk through there if you ever visit. The hallway you go through, it's the most traversed place on the Yale campus. Every student at Yale, and if they're an undergrad in 4 years, probably walks through there 3,000 times. I don't know. Everybody walks by the Yale woman, but nobody, until now, we hope. Well, most people don't know its meaning, how it was done, why it was done. Well, I sent a bunch of slides that you have an assignment now. You should go to Wolsey Hall and check out the war movie.
Yes.
And by the way, there's now a kiosk there. All you gotta do is punch a couple of buttons. It's gonna explain all this to you. There's a new kiosk, and there are gonna be other kiosks on campus. That war memorial came out of an effort. Official Yale decided, okay, we gotta do something. They started doing it with their bicentennial commencement, where they gave 60 some honorary degrees. You can't imagine sitting through that. But it included a whole range of white Southerners, including Thomas Nelson Page, the most popular white supremacist author of popular literature at the time, wildly popular in the North. They honored Thomas Nelson Page 3 times over the next decade. Mark Twain also got an honorary that day, but that was all right. But and so Theodore Roosevelt. Anyway, they finally appointed a committee of about 12, chaired by a former Confederate officer and a former Union officer who were prominent Yale. I can list all the names, but it might bore you. 12 members of this committee. They met for 5 to 6 years on and off, beginning in about 1908, 08, 09. And we have tremendous records. I mean, they wrote it down. They had minutes, and they debated and they debated. First, they debated what should the art look like. They had to make all kinds of aesthetic decisions. Then they debated what would it say. In the end, after much debate, they decided to create a memorial that was completely devoted to honoring both sides in the war equally. And they used the term both sides and all sorts of other. One point they started using the term mingled dust. Okay. And they debated at great length what to call the war. War between the states, this and that. They finally did at least agree to call it a civil war. Now, they also debated whether the word victory or defeat would appear on the monument, and it doesn't in the least. It has 4 allegories. Actually, I find the monument aesthetically beautiful. Next time you go, see what you think. Stop, really look at it. Read chapter 12 of this book first. But it's actually a beautiful monument. The artists were really talented. The 4 allegorical figures: courage, memory, peace, and devotion. Are you against any of those? I mean, are you against having a memory? At my age, I wish I could put it in the corner and get a better one. But so it's a beautiful allegory. But then they had to decide, all right, how do you list the names? Well, they did really serious research. They had to find out who really died in the war. 55 Confederates and 114 Union men. They weren't all combat deaths, but they died in the war, disease, etc. 55 Confederates, 114 Union men. They finally made it, and they had roiling debates over this, and the Southerners took a stand. They wanted full equality, and they got it. The men are listed in the order of their class at Yale. The first one's 1824, and I forget the last one was 1860-something. They're listed in the order of their class at Yale. They're listed with their name, their unit, and where they died. It doesn't say they were a Confederate or they were a Union soldier. You need to, but they're simply listed together, honored totally together. At the dedication, there were only 3 speeches. In each one of them, and President then was one, the speeches were all about this classic notion of reconciliation through valor. Now, I wrote an earlier book called Race and Reunion, which is a big history of the memory of the Civil War way back in 2001. And oddly, I never came to Yale to do any research. That war memorial should have had at least 10 pages in that book. But I didn't know about it. Because the whole argument of the book then was about this culture of reconciliation. That monument is the most significant memorial to the Confederate lost cause on Northern soil. And it's been there now for 110 years. And everybody just walks right by it. I used to go in, when I was writing this, I'd go in there and just hang out, commune with them. And I kept just waiting for some tourists at least stop and look. No, I didn't say anything. Every student has a station, interface, phone, of course. Everyone just goes through. And by the way, on the floor, under the industrial strength purple carpets, are inscriptions, very important inscriptions, which must be restored, in my view. It says, among other things, this is Yale's dedication to the honor and valor of Yale men. And it has 2 verses of a poem by Francis Finch, class of 1849 at Yale, quite a poet, but also eventually became a federal judge. But he wrote a poem in 1866, which became the most prominent, most popular reconciliation poem in the country. It's called Blue in the Grave. So on the floor, 2 verses. Finch's Blue in the Grave, one of which ends with tears and joy for the blue, joy and tears for the gray. Now, it's easy for us to cast stones and make judgments. This chapter really challenged me on this business of making judgments, because Yale had a chance there in a cultural environment that, well, they couldn't resist the cultural environment. They were part of it. They helped create it. But they missed a chance to do something quite interesting in 1915 that a large part of American society was actually asking for, especially African Americans. That memorial hasn't even the slightest hint of what the war was about. Now, that's not uncommon in Civil War memorials of that era. But you must now go to campus at Yale and check out the war memorial after you've read it. I welcome your question.
Right. So,
Whatever you want.
okay. So
As long as you do.
we're gonna take 2 or 3 questions, and you know, I often say this, and I'll say it tonight. what we're doing is you're asking questions. To answer. You know how sometimes that goes a different way and people think, they're the author. So, with that proviso, David will of course welcome any questions.
I was, okay.
Pam?
So I always try to get my head around people like Hill House who participate in something bad and then preach against it. I think we see a lot of that maybe in our society today, people trying to, but I'd love to know more about him. And I don't know if as a historian, it's great to ask you if you can make any sense of that in him, but whatever else, I was just interested by that.
Yeah.
That kind of, always blows my mind.
Well, an easy way out of that is just to say that contradiction makes the world go round. People are really weirdly contradictory creatures. He came from Long Island, his family. In fact, one of their slaves, one of the people they enslaved early on, became arguably the second greatest Black poet of early America, a man named Jupiter Hammond, who moved to New Haven with the Hill House. And there's Phyllis Wheatley,
Yes.
time of the Revolution. Jupiter Hammond was one amazing poet, but he lived with the Hill Houses. He was enslaved by them. So this is, in most cases, domestic slavery. They were a household. I don't think Hill House ever owned any estates, in the South or elsewhere, which some Yale folk did, and in the West Indies. Hill House was a very prominent politician, U.S. senator. So I actually don't know any deeper than that, his own psychological standing. I'd have to go back and read what I actually wrote about him. But, he's not alone. And there are all kinds of contradictions in this. There's the Leonard Bacon, who wasn't a slaveholder, but he was an apologist for them. Morse, who was not a slaveholder. God, was he an apologist for them. And then we have to make those judgments too about the people who actually do grow in the ways we wish they would, Ezra Stiles did, into a pretty enlightened man in the Age of Enlightenment. He took seriously these ideas about natural rights. His successor, Theodore Dwight, is one of the, you talk about contradiction. Oh, Lord. Theodore Dwight was a brilliant man. Theologian, classicist, etc., president of Yale for over 20 years, but he was a counter-revolutionary. He hated the American Revolution. He hated all things French. He was a total Anglophone. He thought the French were, he believed in all kinds of conspiracies about the French and so on. And he gave us Tennessee Calhoun, in a way. Actually, Calhoun later said it was kind of Theodore Dwight's need that he first learned these ideas about a concurrent majority and how states might have the right to nullify. And after all, Theodore Dwight was a staunch Federalist and eventually a strong supporter of the Hartford Convention, although it didn't go anywhere. The New England states were seceded from the Union. So Dwight is, but at the same time, Dwight brought Benjamin Silliman into Yale and put science into universities because he believed in science, which was a move for a theology school because God was supposed to figure it all out. Turns out he might have missed something. But and Benjamin Silliman really is the pioneer of science in university. But boy, was he complicated. Oh, Lord. So this book is full of people like this. And I mean, sometimes we refer to it as the Thomas Jefferson problem. How do you write those words and do that?
Why don't we take a?
I love contradiction. Without it, history just wouldn't be that interesting.
Sir?
I think in the book with the memorial.
Yeah.
What important parts of the history do you feel were meant to be,
Oh, along the way?
well, afterwards?
Oh, okay. I'm grateful for that question because we originally planned to go all the way to the 21st century, which was ludicrous. We weren't going to get there. But we really wanted to get to the 1930s. Through the 20s into the 30s, probably two more chapters, one of them dealing mostly with eugenics, which Yale became the international center of eugenics in the medical school and other places around campus in the 1920s. It left a huge imprint and a long legacy. And we had someone gathering that research, doing terrific work. In fact, he taught a course in it. And he was going to draft at least the beginning of that chapter. He had an illness and couldn't. And we were under strict deadlines from the president's office, to be honest.
Huh.
I didn't understand those deadlines until Peter announced he was leaving the presidency. And I don't understand all these deadlines. And then I wanted to get to the 30s, which is when Yale was rebuilt. That whole neo-Gothic deal was all built in the 30s. That's when all the residential colleges were named. 9 of the first 12 were slaveholders. I wanted to get to that. Although there's oddly not great records on them. They're records, but they're not terrific records. By then, the board wasn't keeping any minutes they didn't want you to see. Which is frankly the way most boards. If you're on a board anywhere, don't write it down. Really? Because you'll get sued. Anyway, so I wanted to get to the 30s, butting up to the World War II era, which becomes a whole nother transition with this university. And by the way, there should be a second volume done. There may be, but it's not going to be by me. There are people interested in doing it, but part of it will depend on the next president and whatever team she or he puts together. But there should be another volume that takes it through another century. That will be less about slavery than about racism, about racial attitudes, about racial sciences, but also the transformations of Yale that happened post-World War II, particularly in the 1960s.
Why don't we take one quick question, one quick answer?
Oh, dear.
Are there other famous buildings? I'm sure there would be that slaves helped build besides Connecticut Hall.
We don't have perfect records, but in the old Brick Row, which is now the freshman quad, the old campus, it's likely some slave labor may have been used on those, but Thomas Clapp was out of the game Thomas Clapp was this incredible record. If somebody worked on something, he recorded it. I don't think we found another building built literally by slave labor.
Yeah.
But I'd have to go back and check. I have to ask Mike Moran who always check me. But a lot of enslaved people worked at Yale,
Right.
in various capacities, up until the time of the American Revolution, and even after, because slavery is legal in Connecticut well into the 19th century, although it's diminishing. Lots of enslaved people in New Haven worked in maritime trade, worked in taverns. It was urban, colonial, early national forms of enslavement. And some worked as farm laborers outside of town, the country. Jonathan Edwards employed a male and female slave most of his adult life. The woman worked in a house, the man worked in his field. Part of our contradictions.
Well, I think that you've gotten a, slight glimpse of the breadth of this book. And, sometimes books written by people of academic standing, like David Blight, write a book that could be impenetrable. But David
I hate
had
it more than you.
It's the gift, and I said in the introduction, of bringing this alive in a way that actually makes it a can't put down book. And so before I close to thank David, I do want to mention one other thing. David's book, that's a biography of Frederick Douglass, I think is one of the finest biographies that I've ever had the privilege of reading. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. Those Pulitzer people also thought so, but
It was a lean year in biography.
yeah. But it gives you a incredible companion to this book. Now you with my saying this, you might remember I am a bookseller. So not only do I think you need to read this book, but I would really urge you to read the Frederick Douglass biography. But I'd like to close, David, by thanking you for really, there's a reason Peter Salve went to you to do this study, because he could count on your integrity, your courage, your capacity to think of history as an alive thing that we need to understand in order to be the best people we can. And I think that we're indebted to you, and will continue to be indebted to you for telling these stories. So please join me in
Just
thanking
to add to
David Blight.
that Peter came to me too, because I direct Center,
Yes.
the Gilbert Lerman Center to Study of Slavery and Abolition, first of its kind anywhere in the world, founded by David Bryan Davis, Tony Davis, your brothers. Peter knew he was lucky to have a center that studied slavery, and my center managed this whole project. So this project has given us some valuable visibility for this little center. And without that, he couldn't have done it either.
You're putting off your applause, David.
Yes.